Thinking outside the universe, God, time, math, reason, artificial intelligence, and the image of God. This is part 1 of 3, God and Time. On a normal afternoon, on a normal day, a small meteorite arrived. When it flashed into our atmosphere, it was large enough not to burn up, but not so large as to do any damage. It left a small crater where it landed in a wooded forest. The crater was soon filled in by the effects of weather, and eventually, moss and mold grew on the meteorite with wild grasses around it. Over time, the forest completely assimilated its visitor so that it looked like any other rock on the forest floor. Only with the most careful analysis could anyone learn that the rock did not belong to our Earth at all, that it was an alien belonging to an ancient comet from the far reaches of the solar system. The famous American scientist Carl Sagan once said, "The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be," from the opening of his series, Cosmos. I believe Carl Sagan was wrong. Like the meteorite in this parable, I believe our universe has co-opted a number of things that don't belong to our universe at all, things that are now in our universe but originated outside of it. The purpose of this story is to explore some of those things. We won't discover them all, and they're not all the same size, but I do think we can discover a few of them. Here are some terms I'm going to use. Naturalism is the term I'm going to use to describe the viewpoint of Carl Sagan, the view that the cosmos, or nature, is all that exists. The natural expected term that one would expect to use to describe things outside the universe or outside of nature would be supernatural. However, I don't want to use supernatural, since that term tends to make people think of God and ghosts and not much else. It's not that supernatural is wrong, but it may give the listener a misleading feeling. Instead, I want to use the term extra-natural. Some of the things we think are very normal are actually extra-natural. Part 1, God. I have to start with God. I toyed with the idea of writing about some of the other things first, but it didn't work. They all end up dragging God into the picture at an early stage. Now, if the listener is not a theist, you could go ahead and skip to a later chapter, but the problem is that God will always be the elephant in the room, and it's way too awkward to ignore the elephant, so I am not going to try. The God that I'm going to talk about is the Christian God. Most of what I say applies to God as described in any of the major monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But I am a Christian and I am talking from a Christian perspective. I am definitely not talking about the God of any pantheistic religion like Hinduism or some of the Eastern religions. In those religions, God is part of the universe, or everything in the universe makes up God, or something like that. Although I call those Eastern religions, they haven't stayed in the East. The Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza was a 17th century rationalist who advocated that sort of pantheism. More recently, the Star Wars movies, which I loved, brought this idea into popular Western culture with the concept of the Force. Life creates it, they said about the Force, and so on. You can feel the Force. It was part of the universe. That kind of pantheistic God or force has a lot of appeal nowadays because it doesn't make any moral demands on you. You can call on it when you want to and forget about it when you don't want to. It's a very convenient God, but it isn't truth, and so we're going to set it aside for the remainder of this discussion. The God that I'm talking about is the Christian God, and he is outside the universe. God exists outside of the universe. The Bible begins by saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Bible teaches that God made the universe. He is not the universe, and he's not dependent on it. For the Christian listener, I want to say that What I'm saying about God is not some novel or private interpretation. Although the ancients didn't usually talk in the same terms I'm using in this discussion, it's very consistent with what they believe. To demonstrate this, I'd like to quote a few lines from the Nicene Creed as it was amended in 381 AD. This is one of the oldest Christian creeds, and it's held as reliable in Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant churches. The Nicene Creed begins, "I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible." This line states that God is the creator of heaven and earth. He's not part of it, but rather he made it. The scope of what he made includes all things visible and invisible. The creed continues, "I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father before all worlds, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made." The main reason the Nicene Creed was developed was to establish a proper understanding of the person of Jesus Christ. The Creed says that Jesus was not created, but begotten, and this before all worlds. Using the best terminology they could find, this not only makes Jesus co-equal with God the Father, but it places Jesus outside the universe. It continues, "Who for us men and for our salvation came down from heaven and was incarnate by the Holy Ghost of the Virgin Mary and was made man." This phrase saying Jesus came down from heaven addresses the great Christian doctrine of the incarnation, God who created the universe, entering into the universe and becoming a part of it, a human being. Using the language of the introduction to this talk, Jesus was by far the largest meteorite that ever came to be part of our own earth. The creed ends with the words, "We look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come." These words indicate that the Christian church is looking in faith for something to happen that does not happen in this universe. We don't currently have any resurrections or lives to come. That's not a part of this universe, but it is a part of the Christian faith. Chapter 2, Time. In the previous chapter, I talked about something, God, which is outside the universe. Now, before we talk about anything else that's outside the universe, I want to talk about something that is not outside the universe, although we often treat it like it is. Time is not outside the universe. Time is part of the universe. Time was created by God. The problem is that from our point of view, time proceeds in a steady rate in one direction. It's as close as anything can come to being an absolute fixed standard. It seems from our imagination that time could, in theory, go forward in the same direction forever, though it is harder to imagine how it could have gone on backward to an infinite past. But this imagination is all wrong, and it's because our perspective is too small. If I look out the window, the world sure looks flat, but it's not. In the same way, time is not an absolute, and things outside the universe, like God, do not live under its constraints. I'm going to offer some arguments for this point from the Bible and also from science, but before I do, I'd like to illustrate it by an analogy. Many readers will be familiar with The Lord of the Rings, the book series by J.R.R. Tolkien, which was also made into a movie trilogy. In The Lord of the Rings, there was a timeline of events happening in what was called Middle Earth. Early in the first book of the trilogy, Bilbo the Hobbit celebrates his 111th birthday. So here's a question. If Bilbo was 111 years old early in the book, was Bilbo born before or after J.R.R. Tolkien fought in the First World War Battle of the Somme? Hopefully, the reader or the listener will realize that the question is nonsense. Tolkien doesn't live under the timeline he created for The Lord of the Rings. In the same way, God doesn't live under the timeline he created for the universe. We are like the characters in the book. God is like the author. Now, as to arguments, in the previous chapter, I started with God, so this time I'm going to start with science. We may feel like time is a universal absolute, a constant, but it is not. If a listener has a handle on how time is addressed in Einstein's theories of special relativity and general relativity, then this will be familiar. If not, I am not going to explain all about relativity, not even close, but I would like to describe just a few things about how time is relative. According to Einstein's theory of special relativity, time varies based on speed. If there were two 20-year-old twins, and one got on a spaceship that traveled far faster than any we have today, so fast that it got to a significant percentage of the speed of light, what would happen? When the twin from the spacecraft returned and met his twin who didn't travel, the twin in the spacecraft would be younger than the twin who stayed at home. It is possible that the homebound twin would be 60 years old, while the traveling twin would be only 30 years old. The clock the twin kept on the spacecraft would also log only 10 years worth of activities, while the clock that stayed home would record 40 years. Time is running at different rates for the two twin brothers. There is also general relativity that's different from special relativity, which indicates that time is relative based on the force of gravity. This time, let's put the two twins in two different spaceships and have one of them fly in the direction of a black hole, a supermassive object, which, if you get too close, will not even let light escape its gravity. The twin in the spacecraft not approaching the black hole, that will be the twin on the far right, will perceive that his brother's spacecraft is moving slower and slower, but it will never look like he gets all the way to the event horizon of the black hole. An event horizon is the point at which light can't get out. At the same time, the twin in the spacecraft approaching the black hole will look back at his brother who's staying away, and if he could see clearly, he would watch his brother rapidly grow old and die. Time is running at different rates for the two twin brothers. Some listeners may look doubtfully on this discussion, since relativity is hard to understand, and sometimes we get suspicious of things we don't really understand. A further complication is that these are still the theories of relativity, and theories may eventually be shown to be wrong. That might happen with relativity, but I want you to know that they won't be wrong in a way that meaningfully refutes what I just described. If they are wrong, it will be because they don't work completely at the quantum level or something like that. As far as we know now, the theory of relativity not only is right, but we also have to adjust for it in the real world. One good example is the GPS satellite system. If you have a smartphone and use the map functions for directions, you use this system. The GPS satellite system is a network of 24 satellites orbiting the Earth. Because satellites in space are moving at a higher speed relative to where we are on Earth, clocks on a GPS satellite run 7 microseconds slower per day than clocks on Earth due to special relativity. However, because we on Earth are closer to the Earth's center and subject to a greater force of gravity than the satellites are, clocks on a GPS satellite run 45 microseconds a day faster than clocks on Earth. In short, clocks on a satellite run 45 microseconds faster because of gravity, minus 7 microseconds slower because of motion, or 38 microseconds a day faster than clocks on Earth. GPS satellites are programmed to make this 38 microsecond adjustment due to relativity. If they did not make this adjustment, the way the GPS network works, your smartphone directions would drift off by more than a whopping 11 kilometers per day, or 6 miles per day. Time relativity is true. You may have seen the scene. Flight controllers at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory wait with bated breath to see if their spaceship lands safely on Mars. They've been working on their project for years, and now it all depends on whether or not the spacecraft can make it through the thin Mars atmosphere and land safely without having a fatal crash. It's not the first time we've tried this, and it doesn't always work. This time, the spacecraft lands safely and sends a signal back home. Everyone cheers. But the funny thing is, when everyone cheers, it's not for something that just happened. They are cheering for something that happened 12 minutes earlier. Depending on where Mars is in relation to Earth, it takes at least 6 minutes for the electronic signal to get here. And if Mars is on the far side of the sun, it can take more than 20 minutes. Nothing goes faster than the speed of light, so it takes time for information to get to us. The sun may have blown up 7 minutes ago, but we wouldn't know it for another minute yet. When we look at stars that are farther away, we are not seeing them the way they are today. We are only seeing what they looked like long ago. So how fast do the clocks run from God's perspective? Which of the twins' times applies? When does God see things that happen in the universe? I think a Christian or most any theist would have to agree that God sees things differently than we do with regard to time. If we see something far away, like a star, we are not seeing the present, but rather the distant past. Christians believe God is omnipresent, that is, everywhere at once. An omnipresent God would at least see everything when it actually happens. But if we understand that God is outside the universe, we should also understand that he is outside of time entirely. Trying to ask when something happened for God makes no more sense than comparing a timeline of J.R.R. Tolkien's life with the timeline for Bilbo Baggins. In the Bible, there are several passages that also seem to indicate that God is outside of the timeline for the universe, and that people who have died or any spiritual being who is with God is outside that timeline as well. In John 8:56, Jesus says to the Pharisees, "Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." Think for a minute about the verb tenses in that sentence. Abraham had died almost 2,000 years before. It confused the listeners. Look it up for context. Jesus doubled down a minute later, saying, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." Understanding that God does not live under the timeline of the universe may help us to better understand some difficult points in the Bible and in Christian theology. I'll give several examples. In Christian theology, it is commonly understood that Satan and demons are fallen angels. However, Christians often are unclear on the concept if they have to discuss when this fall took place. In some ways, it seems like it should be before the creation of the earth, and certainly before the fall of man, but it doesn't seem like there's a good time or enough time there to let that happen. Later, in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, the last book of the Bible, John sees a vision of this fall happening, not past tense, and it's all wrapped up in the last times. As long as we understand that what happened with Satan getting kicked out of heaven was something outside the physical universe, then we should also understand that it was outside of time as we know it. The question as to when it happened becomes meaningless. In Luke 23:43, Jesus, who is being crucified and is about to die, says to the thief crucified on the cross next to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." This verse has been rightly reassuring to Christians, as it holds out the promise that if we are absent from the body, we are present with the Lord. At the same time, it has been confusing. For one thing, Christian theology doesn't exactly have Jesus going to paradise during the time frame between his crucifixion and resurrection. He descended into Hades, according to the Apostles' Creed. Even more confusing is that the clear teaching of the Bible and all Christian churches is that we are promised a resurrection of the body at the last day. So we end up imagining a situation where someone dies and his soul or spirit goes to be with the Lord, and then at the last day it makes a comeback to get back into the original body, but in a resurrected or glorified form. I'm not saying that that idea is entirely wrong. I'm just saying that the only part of it that is confusing is that part that pertains to time. And time with the Lord is not the same as it is for us who are still entirely inside the physical universe. Perhaps this understanding of time being part of the universe and God being outside of the universe could also shed some light on the complex topic of reconciling God's foreknowledge and man's free will. That's far too deep a topic to get into here, but I offer it as a thing to think about. This concludes part 1 of 3 of this video series. The next video, part 2, will discuss reason and math.